Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Global Forum. My name is Jun Liu. I'm Vice Provost for Global Affairs and the Dean of International Academic Programs and Professor of Linguistics at Stony Brook University. If you browse the website of Stony Brook University today, you might see the headline news that our President Sam Stanley, is going to be a panelist in 2018 Paul Simon Awards event. Next Tuesday at 5:30, there will be live stream of panelists to be moderated by NAFSA Executive Director on comprehensive internationalization. Stony Brook University is one of the 5 universities in the United States receiving this distinguished award. That means that the whole campus has put effort and emphasis on campus internationalization. Today's event is one of them. So we launched the Global Forum 2 years ago with a purpose to bring campus community together to discuss issues that are pertinence to what we do and how we do things. So we have done more than 8 events so far, such as global competence, intercultural communication, global engineering or global medicine, global health, then all these issues we are talking about on a daily basis. And today I'm particularly delighted that our organizer, Professor Wolf Schaefer, has put together a very impressive panelist on a very cutting-edge topic called Ethical Artificial Intelligence, the Design of Moral Machines. First, let me introduce our 3 panelists. Professor Wolf Schaefer, received his higher education in the Marburg-Bonn, King's College London, Munich, and Bremen. He earned an MA in History, International Politics and Philosophy, as well as a PhD in Social History and History of Science and Technology. He has worked at a Max Planck Institute with Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. I don't speak German, so you can see how awkward. But Jürgen Habermas in the 1970s in Germany and became a professor in Darmstadt in 1985. Professor Schaefer joined the history department of Stony Brook University in 1989. After many years of service as a Stony Brook University professor and occasional administrator, he moved in 2016 from the College of Arts and Sciences to the College of Engineering and Applied Sciences. There he was asked by Dean Soteropoulos to chair the Department of Technology and Society. Dr. Schaefer has published over 80 articles and 10 books. He has pioneered global history as an alternative to world history, founded a Center for Global and Local History, as well as the Stony Brook University's Institute for Global Studies in the Office of Global Affairs. He has recently finished a 200-page manuscript on Donald Trump entitled American Genius, Dark Words and Winds of Change. He is researching the management of big science projects in the United States and Germany during the World War II, and has now begun to investigate SMART, that is, computational ethics. Our next speaker on the panel is Stephen Skinner. Stephen Skinner is a distinguished teaching professor of computer science and the director of the AI Institute at Stony Brook University. His research interests include the design of graph, string, and geometric algorithms and their applications, particularly to biology. He is the author of 6 books, including Algorithm Design Manual and a Data Science Design Manual, and Who's Bigger?, where historical figures really rank. Skinner received his PhD in computer science from the University of Illinois in 1988, and the author of over 150 technical papers. He is a former Fulbright Scholar and recipient of ONR Young Investigator Award and IEEE Computer Science and Engineer Teaching Award. Last but not least is Andreas Hinteknash. Andreas Hinteknash is a chemist and medical doctor. He serves as a senior manager in the group research department in Daimler AG. He received his PhD in electronic chemistry from the ETH Zurich and the Paul Schaeffer Institute in Switzerland in 2010. After a postdoc stay in MIT in the field of lithium air and catalysis 2010-11, he joined the research department of Daimler AG, where he serves as a senior manager. In the medical field, he is a full professor in medicine too, with a specialization in laboratory medicine radiology. His present focus in research are two large fields, one in energy storage and conversion with a strong focus on electrochemistry, batteries and fuel cells, electronical energy storage, conversion materials and systems, sustainability, and toxicology. The other is technology assessment, which is linked both to developments to the field of automotive as well as medicine learning, and artificial intelligence in analytical and decision-making processes in medicine. One of the most challenging fields of technology assessments is automated or autonomous driving, as well as conversion of the current fossil fuel-based economy to sustainable fossil-free economy. He is author of more than 50 research papers and more than 100 patents, and recipient of the Swiss Electric Research Award and scholarships from two major pharmaceutical companies. As you can hear, that their record and research are very impressive. So today, I'm glad you are all here to listen to what they have to say, but we are going to have plenty of time for you to ask questions, to engage in a conversation, which I hope will be very, very beneficial to all of us. So let's extend a warm welcome to our panelists. I'm referring to Wolf to start the presentation.
I just want to announce that we will be speaking in the order that we are sitting there. So Steve starts first, Andreas second, and I will conclude. And we try to speak, each of us tries to speak for 20 minutes about, right? And that, I hope, will give us then some time also for question and answers.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me see if that is working. Okay, so we're here to discuss ethics and AI systems. And so I figured we'd start. It's probably best to start with trying to figure out what actually does ethics mean. Okay, to a computer scientist, maybe sometimes you need a refresher. But what does ethics mean? I go to the dictionary definition, and the definition that came to mind was moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. And so the two words there that I think are going to be most important for us. One is this idea of people, okay, that it's a person's behavior. I think that it's important to think when we talk about ethics, we're talking about governing how people behave, more so than we're governing how computers behave. Now, of course, it's people who build AI systems and people who use AI systems. And so I think the ethical issues are going to be basically the demands are on the people who build them and use them. The other issue has to do with a question of moral principles. And I guess the point that I think is going to lead to some things that we talk about. Moral principles are often in tension with each other. There's different objectives, different principles people would like to aspire to. And it's also true that different people can hold to different beliefs about these principles. And that makes for an interesting discussion. So first of all, the idea of AI and ethics and how it's going to change the world, recognize that this question of how technology affects the world is an old question. It goes back at least to Prometheus. Okay, that's the Greek god who stole fire. The ancient Greek myth about the man who stole fire and brought it to people. And of course, fire was a great thing because it enabled us to cook food. It enabled us to keep warm. Fire is a bad thing because it labels to hurt ourselves, to kill people by burning them. It can burn down our houses. And there's always a tension and a trade-off that comes from, the benefits of technology and the risks of technologies. And you can ask this about any kind of technologies out there. Is nuclear energy, what's good, what's bad? Genetically modified organisms. AI, like any other interesting technology, has very positive aspects and potentially negative aspects. And I guess the ethical issues go in how do we navigate that kind of a trade-off. So why is AI exciting these days? Again, I'm sure everyone here has come because they've heard about AI, they know it. I would probably link AI very much to the concept of machine learning. And there has kind of been amazing progress over the last, let's say, 10 years in building systems that learn from data. When I was in graduate school 30 years ago, my friend studied machine learning, and I laughed at him through graduate school because he was working on these neural nets and they couldn't do anything. But now the world is different, okay? That suddenly about 10 years ago, machines and data reached a certain critical mass where you really could build systems that learn amazing things from large amounts of training data. You see this in natural language processing systems, okay? You've probably spent time talking to machines now. There's times, you either dictation or you call up somebody for a help desk. Machines are much better at speech understanding than they ever were. And this is because of the new machine learning technology. If you use Google Translate, the translations between languages are wildly better than they were only a few years ago. And the reason is because of this machine learning technology. In computer vision, okay, the systems that can look at a picture or look at a video and recognize what objects are in there are wildly better than they were 5 years ago. This is one of the things that is sort of making self-driving cars a possibility. It's one of these things that are improving medical diagnosis. You can have, start looking at tissue samples, pathology samples, and look and see, does this sample tell cancer? Okay, where are there potentially cancerous cells? These things require machine learning, computer vision, things like that. And again, the power that's doing, I don't want to go into the details here, the power that is going through it is this technology called deep learning, which is basically about neural networks. Let's see if I have the power to, no, I don't think I have the power to view with the laser. But basically, there are these models that are in some rough sense inspired by architectures of how brains work, but in a very rough sense. But the bottom line is that these systems have the property that they get better the more data you train them on. That's generally the rate limiting step, is how much data do you have that is good and interesting. The models that they produce are as good or bad as the data that it's trained on. And, kind of the other thing is that the reasons why these models make this decisions are incredibly opaque. It used to be with certain systems, when a system model told you this was the right thing to do, the model could give you some explanation. For the most part, the machine learning models people build today can't really tell you why they are making their decisions, okay? They can generally make good decisions, okay? You can see the performance is good, you trust it. But exactly why it did one thing instead of another doesn't really come with an explanation, and it's kind of invisible to people. And that's the source of some of the ethical issues that come up with these systems. So what is it? Well, starting a few years ago, as these machine learning models started gaining power and gaining performance, people started realizing that they were potentially problems or ethical issues, problems on how they will interact with society. And there's been a slew of books about this recently. I recommend the two on the left, particularly Weapons of Math Destruction and Hello World. But the kind of ethical issues that I think of them as falling into about 4 different kind of classes. One, there's a class of issues related to economic dislocation. There's this fear that computers are coming to take our jobs away. Okay, and how is that going to change the world? There are concerns about privacy. Okay, they know that these models train on large amount of data. Okay, what is the are they using my data? How are they using it? How is this going to affect me? There are concerns about bias. if you have models that can make decisions in opaque ways, how do we know that they are not doing it to reflect biases against particular racial groups, genders, things like that? Okay? And the final class of concern, I think, revolve on what I would call agency issues. How do we know that people are adequately in the loop to step in when the models do something wrong? Okay? And so what I'd like to do with the rest of my time basically is to go through what I think of are the major issues in these categories. First, with respect to economic dislocation, again, it seems that as computers can do more and more, as machine learning systems can do more and more things, there are certainly tasks that traditionally have been done by people that are in danger of being, either in danger or there's the opportunity to have machines do this kind of work. Certain classes of blue-collar work are threatened, okay, with self-driving cars, questions about, do we need taxi drivers? Do we need truckers? Okay, is going to be a question. As you get computer vision systems that are better at, at monitoring places and seeing where there are threats, do you need security guards? These seem like, legitimate concerns. For many people in this room, the bigger concern is that there's now white-collar work, classes of white-collar work that is sort of being threatened, okay? That, I was reading recently about a competition that some law software for lawyers firm ran, where they had contracts. And the question was, given these contracts, they gave them to 20 lawyers and they gave them to their software. They said, find the loopholes, find the problems. And the claim was that the software did a better job than the people did, okay? To whatever extent that's true, the question is things like reading contracts, routine legal work, translation and transcription work, okay? These things are things that there's danger of automation. In education, you can imagine computers coming up with individual lesson plans for individual people. Where does that leave the college professor? Okay, how is this going to change the way education goes? Again, we think about medical diagnosis and pathology. If computers get better at reading slides than pathologists, why do you need the pathologist? So there's a tremendous threat of potential dislocation. And because there's such a wide threat of class of jobs that are potentially being affected by these technologies, it's hard to know exactly what you're supposed to study. This, I imagine, if we have students out here, this is an area of some concern. You want to go into a field that is going to be there for you. And, we're in a period of change. Okay? That said, I think that there are some caveats we need to know. One is I do believe that jobs are not going away. Okay? I think that future jobs will largely involve working with AI systems to do a better job. All of you guys are used to working on a computer to having your, help you with your job by doing things when you're doing document preparation or information search and things like that. It's going to be smarter systems that you're going to be interacting with, but I believe that it will lend you to do better work. And that motivates that there's going to be a need for broader general education. People who know about technology, people who know how to communicate, people who have senses of empathy, because I think that's one of the things that computers are not going to be as good at as people. Again, the concern about jobs getting away, one thing to note today is that unemployment is now under 4% in the United States. 10 years ago, in the heart of the recession, it looked like all the jobs were going. Oh my God, what were people going to do? And the answer is economies do evolve. So I do believe that jobs are not going away. Jobs are going to change, okay? But this technology is there. And again, it's always been the case that new technologies have come, they have destroyed jobs, yet generated new and better ones in ways that people couldn't necessarily foresee then. And so my lesson to anyone that's a student in here, you got to wear your tennis shoes. The world is going to change. You're going to have to live in a world of adapting to it. Okay, that's on economic dislocation. Another class of concerns, as we said, have to do with privacy. Okay, the reason why these models have gotten better is because they have tremendous amounts of training data. And, we now live in a world where there are large companies the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons of the world that have access to amazing amounts of personal information about you and everybody else in the country. Okay? And, many people find this threatening. There's other notions of privacy concerns. Okay? Video technologies like face recognition have gotten wildly better. So it's fair to say, that there's security cameras anywhere. I have to believe there's one in this room someplace. Okay? These things will be hooked up to things like face recognition systems and eventually. And there will be, potentials to monitor who's going where and things like that in ways people find threatening. And what should be done or what should not be done with it? These are sort of societal questions to know what do we want, how much do we value privacy, things like this. I will say that there's other parts of the world, like Europe, that do a much better job protecting data privacy than the United States. And so there are rooms of what you can do with laws if society feels that data privacy is an important issue. And we'll leave it at that. And again, there's more subtle questions about privacy that comes up and ethics of what's right and what's not right. Computer models can make inferences about you, about things that maybe you haven't shared with anybody. There are interesting things about telemarketing agencies figuring out that someone is pregnant before they have told anybody else, based on what they are buying and what patterns it looks like. Okay? And there are systems that, for example, models people have built that would try to look at pictures and try to predict whether someone is gay or not. Okay? These are, in some sense, privacy-oriented issues. The question of to what extent, should people be concerned about, models making inferences about you from things like this. Probably what's getting the most attention as far as ethical issues these days have to be concerns about bias in models. Models are as good as the data, machine learning models are as good or as bad as the data that they are trained on. And if, and if your data has biases about race or gender in it, the model will learn from these biases. There are interesting examples of problems that have come up. Amazon recently, there was a story about a resume screener project that Amazon tried to build to screen all their resumes and decide who was good or bad. And these models would build it. They'd look at which people had Amazon hired and which people did Amazon not hire, and can we try to replicate those decisions? Well, what they found were that several of the features that were most important of these systems. If I remember the single most important features these systems involved, one was the name Jared. If your name was Jared, it liked you. And if you played lacrosse, it liked you. These systems were kind of opaque. They learn from data. Exactly what they're learning is somewhat mysterious. And this system was never put into practice because it couldn't get the biases out. Other problems, I guess, Google had a thing with image search recently where you train image search on people, on examples of images. There are not as many faces out there for minority groups, members of minority groups, as there are of majority groups. And so the accuracy of things like face recognition and things like that varies wildly by group because of this, and that causes issues. So bottom line is there's a lot of models that people can build that are making important decisions now, trying to decide who's going to be assigned bail, what criminal is going to be granted parole based on data about them. Models for rating which teachers should we fire this teacher or not. And, the big problem, I think, is a lot of these models are very opaque. People don't really know what's going on. Often they're run by proprietary companies, and the school system can't really, or the user of it can't really investigate what it's really using to make its decisions. And, and often they're not properly screened for bias, and that is sort of a concern. So AI systems and bias is a problem. That said, we have a couple of caveats. People are also biased. People have been screening resumes for a long time, and there's undoubtedly a considerable bias in everybody's judgment. When they look at resumes, people see different things. They think different things based on their background and their upbringing and things like this. And so I do think it is going to be quite possible to build AI systems that are better at this than people. Okay, I think that it's possible to validate the performance of these things better on a larger scale, like an AI system, than viewing individual people for whether their decisions are biased or not. And like I was saying, the bias in AI systems that have been reported, usually it's an accidental thing. It's not been a deliberate or malicious thing. And people are now have started to recognize the problems, or are now aware that this is one thing they should be concerned about. The other thing that I guess comes up in the question of ethics of these systems, is it's very, very hard to sometimes define what fairness, what the right thing to do really is. You can imagine a model to try to detect whether a criminal is going to, a person should be granted bail, whether or not they're going to violate the terms of the bail. You might want to optimize to minimize the number of mistakes, or you might want to optimize to make sure it treats all different groups equally. Those are two different criteria. You get different answers. And which society wants and values as the right objective for these systems, okay, is something that requires a conversation. And the final class of, I guess, issues that I wanted to just highlight is that I think there's what we would call agency issues with AI. I think everybody has this fear that the machines are going to get smart and take over the world. This, I think, is not the fear that people need to imminently worry about. Your car is getting smarter. Your car is not going to take over the world, okay? I think that the real problem that when it comes to sort of agency and running things is the degree of trust that people, putting the right level of trust on AI models, okay? Often, like there's questions, should AI algorithms be able to fire weapons in combat? That is an ethical question that needs some kind of an answer, okay? When is a self-driving car safe enough? Is it safe enough when it's as good as a person, or must it be better than people? Or must it be perfect? These are ethical questions, societal questions people have to kind of answer. One thing that is an important thing is that mistakes have to be correctable. It's often the case that models make decisions. If decisions models make are not being supervised by people, you get very frustrating things. If, let's say, all jobs were given by companies after they screened resumes with programs to evaluate it. If there was something that rated your resume bad, who are you going to argue with? Okay? You can't argue with the program. If there's not a person behind it who you can have some level of interaction with, these decisions get made kind of automatically behind the scenes, and there's no appeal to these kind of processes. And so I think the real big question is going to be humans are going to have to come up with validation of what are who makes the decisions, who's in charge, us or the systems that we're building, okay? And what is the right way to use these things morally, okay? So in conclusion, just to sum up, basically, I think the technologists and the public need to be aware of what these models are doing, what the powers are, and what their limitations are, because you're going to be interacting with them and having to make these societal decisions, okay? All technologies involve trade-offs, okay? And our society is going to have to evolve some kind of visions of what we value and what we don't value. Generally speaking, I think that from the AI systems, we should be able to realize the good things from the AI technology without the really bad things happening, provided there are the proper incentives and regulations kind of in place, and that the work to establish what these incentives and norms are has to be happening now. And that's basically what I wanted to say, and I'd like to hand it over to Andreas.
So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Wolf, for the invitation, giving the opportunity to have a closer insight into a specific part of that discussion between ethics and artificial intelligence from the perspective of mobility and technology in general. One part of that will be cars, but please keep in mind that there are trucks, trains, as well as airplanes as well. Nevertheless, trains and airplanes operate in a highly regulated field. That's why I will focus on, let's say, individual mobility, which is in our daily life typically cars. So in the beginning, we could argue and discuss why, in general, technology companies or car manufacturers in general have to care about ethics. There are laws actually, and legalization could do the job, actually applying laws that companies and society in general could just follow. But if you have a look at the mobility sector in 21st century, I was trying to summarize that within a couple of individual letters. That is most likely connectivity, and you know that from your daily experience from using social media and smartphones, as well as autonomous. There's a differentiation between autonomous and automated. But if you forget for a moment about the social background of that discussion, then autonomous vehicles in general, autonomous mobility is when computerized systems, automated systems do the decision-making process. Now, I think we can agree on the two, on the S and the E, that future mobility will be emission-free, not only in California, but in other parts of the world as well. If we have a look in the mirror tonight, you will figure out that you, as and being a medical doctor, you have just a few sensors. You have eyes, you have ears, you have the nose, you have the sense of your skin, but that's actually it. That's it. You might argue that you have a gut feeling as well, which is difficult to put into an algorithm. That's why technical systems get dozens, almost 100 of sensors, and autonomous vehicles nowadays try to mimic what our body and our brain does nowadays with creating a mass of sensors, creating terabytes per minute of data that is then evaluated by a computerized system, trying to mimic the decision-making progress that humans are very, very efficient actually to do. Maybe not perfect, but at least very efficient and proven for decades and centuries and generations. Nevertheless, there's a very good understanding of ethics from human beings that is very difficult to apply in vehicles. And that's why I want to focus on that with the upcoming slides, with a very simple examples that you might know from daily life. When there's an obstacle in front of a vehicle, maybe even in front of a train, typically a person will brake and slow down the vehicle, the car or the train in general, lead to a full stop and usually avoid the collision. It gets more complex once you think about two groups. There's a school bus on this one side and a tree on the other side. Of course, for a human, at least to my understanding, the value of the school bus is higher than the tree. People loving trees might see that from a different perspective, but I think the general consensus might be that protection of human lives is more important than just protecting this plant, the tree. If we get to a more complex level and gets to two groups of people, let's say more elderly people and much younger people, it's already in the center of an ethical discussion about what to do in that particular situation. The good answer from the engineering level is that it can be pre-programmed in those algorithms. It's not a fuzzy logic that makes a decision in the last milliseconds before the decision is made. It's usually preset. And that is why, and will be part of this talk, why we need to care about ethics in the engineering and the development and research of those systems, for example, in the mobility sector, and train the people that do the algorithm programming and algorithm evaluation as soon as possible to develop a kind of mindset from the ethical standpoint. Nevertheless, there are some potential and very promising approaches in the future, and that is linked to the connectivity, that decision making, and the previous talk already pointed that out, does not only rely as humans do on our own sensors, our own feelings, our own knowledge. If we link together, for example, a lot of cars and connect the sensors to each other and let the cars and the vehicles, the elements in general, talk to each other, then the car or a train can see around the corner, because there's a transformation of information from one element, from one vehicle to the other one, actually letting the system operate as a more larger system in which a single element behaves in a larger group of elements, independent of a decision, whether a mainframe, a centralized system makes a decision, or whether it's a trade-off between individual needs between those vehicles or elements in a system. So there will be some help from large amount of data that comes from outside of the space of a single element, for example, outside of a vehicle, from other vehicles or other, let's say, infrastructural parts that give advice to the decision-making progress. There is not yet a forecasting needed with humans. There's not a gut feeling needed anymore whether a red light in traffic systems might turn red or green within the next half of a second, because the system knows that and can tell all the elements, like all the vehicles, and share this information. So a decision can be made much better based on some information. Nevertheless, there's a lot of freedom to operate left, in which we need to operate, in which we need to establish some of the ethical background. If you dig down, and I guess we have done that in the talk before, artificial intelligence into all the subsets, then there's a discussion between Europe and the United States, because in Europe we are much more likely to call it machine learning, coming forward from the discussion in the 1930s and 50s, when it came from a part of engineering and physics, which described the process that machines were enabled to learn based on experience, a kind of artificial experience, based on data to develop and optimize algorithms. Well, the artificial intelligence in general is just the roof. It's a part of the larger part. Machine learning is part of the larger system, like artificial intelligence. Nevertheless, and I will dig in that in an upcoming slides a little bit, it's important to differentiate whether it's a forward-looking approach more on machine learning, that it's based on previous experience, or whether it's trying to forecast future decisions based on a kind of artificial intelligence where no experience and potentially not even data is yet available. There are some decision-making processes, for example, medicine, in which we cannot rely on any kind of experience or data where a kind of forecasting is needed, because just in terms of evaluation of a new medication, we cannot wait another 30 years to find out whether medication A is better than medication B for treating of a certain disease. So we need to rely on very initial data and then do a forecasting process that cannot be based on just experience or former data. If we try to structure that a little bit, and the good news for all people working in that field, we need any single part of that, not only this kind of supervised learning or machine learning, which is the more precise actually description of that, but even very simple clustering or image recognition techniques. It's obvious that in radiology, image recognition might be much easier to use, maybe much more useful, rather than a specific machine learning, which might be more important and more efficient, for example, in some parts of pharmaceutical chemistry, when you get a lot of data from laboratory analyses of blood and the hormones as well. Nevertheless, for example, in the mobility sector, because it's a very broad field in general, we might need all the techniques that come together to a final system where image recognition, clustering of information is highly needed and contributes even to the side aspect where it comes to the supervised learning, because there's an exchange between those fields. Though those are not kind of silos which work individually. There are connections between those different fields, for example, from the learning aspect, from the supervised learning to the unsupervised learning aspect. And one of those systems or approaches can be translated into the other one at a later point of time, just by changing some of the parts of the system, how it operates. I will skip that because we had that in the talk actually before. If we have a closer look, and Wolf will bring up a much nicer picture, I guess, as what I had seen before, how image recognition and clustering works as well, and why some images look very similar, but to humans they are very different. If sensors nowadays try to figure out what in daily life is going on, there is one good example, one shape in nature that you can find quite easily on images. That's a highly symmetric part of a circle, because that does not exist in nature. So a kind of roundish, a compact disc shapes cluster of elements is easy to identify in nature, as well as a highly symmetric part is often very easy to identify because it doesn't exist to 100% in nature. On the other hand, a 90-degree angle doesn't exist in nature too. That's very easy to figure out for a system-based approach. This can be used when it comes to image recognition as well as clustering of information. And for example, figuring out the speed limit in most of the European countries, where it's put on a circular disc actually that has different colors. But in the middle of this disc, there's a number written that gives you the miles per hour that are allowed to drive. And that's very easy to figure out for a camera, where in the US we have square-shaped parts that is much more difficult, in particular when it's a snowy or foggy day. So there are external aspects, external arguments that without being engineered like that can help a camera, a computer system to make a decision, for example, to figure out that a circle part of the image is this kind of speed limit or it's not. The engineers, I guess, never thought about that 100 years ago when they thought about a circle that is to put a number inside for the speed limit. Nevertheless, nowadays, it turns out to be highly efficient, in particular for camera systems. This is the external extrinsic factor that can help artificial-like systems to operate like an artificial system or machine learning system, just because there's some external support that supports the algorithms, that helps the algorithms. In medicine, there are some approaches by some specific patients where you would like to find out whether an alcohol addicted person might have a fall back and starts drinking again. So nowadays we rely on psychological question and answer routines to find out whether a person is stable enough or not. In the future, algorithms might do some other kind of analysis, but very soon people will find out how algorithms make decisions and then try to mitigate the most critical questions and answer all the non-critical questions very honestly, and the other maybe in a different way. Sorry for that. If you go back to the supervised learning, and I just brought 2 slides just to remind all of us how machine learning as well as supervised learning, because that's an intermediate step of building algorithms, can work. But you know, for math classes, it's actually very simple to do like linear regression or other kind of regression functions of distributed data points in a certain amount and find, for example, a certain polynomial. That's very easy to do once you have individual fragmented aspects of data points that are, for example, given from scattered data, that are given from individual data points from any kind of experiments where you have timestamps or other XY data that, as you might know from your colleagues, that are more in the natural science field. Once you think about millions, billions of data, for example, that come up in medical science when it comes about the tumor size or the effect of certain medication, or about reliability of drivers, for example, of cars, where you have individuals where it's not a black and white decision, where you have all the analog data in between, whether it's not real good or bad, but all the aspects in between, then it becomes more kind of pattern recognition, where it's important to make a decision not on the good or bad level, but to find actually patterns in larger amount of data as involved in larger systems that have a tendency to change over time. Humans are learning, systems in supervised learning are learning and actually developing themselves, adopting to the life. Over the next decades, you will adopt to the change in society as well, maybe changing your style of driving, as well as people are changing their lifestyle and therefore actually operate different under the same medication that they might need. So there is a supervised learning systems needed as a roof structure of part of machine learning, or as a part of this machine learning system that brings together actually the human aspects of learning as well as training system in this supervised learning, how humans work. It's a way to mimic actually how humans learn, how humans process information and put it more, I guess, in silicio, that is in the silicon chip of a system. Most of those nowadays computer systems are too slow to process data. And actually we all can be happy that many secret services in the 1980s, on the one hand, had a lot of data, on the other hand, didn't have the power to process it. There were not the mainframe systems available for KGB or SVR, I don't know the Russian name, for one of those secret services. I'm actually too young, I guess, for that. But for most of those secret services, they're sitting on masses of data, but didn't have the power to evaluate it. Nowadays, with more advanced computer systems, in particular when it comes in maybe the next 10 years to something like quantum computing, when computational processes get much faster, those algorithms, those approaches have much higher value because they lead to the situation that classical processes that were prohibitive, just because of less lack of computational power, will be enabled, and without actually try to forecasting something out of space, we can rely on data and just try to find patterns like Amazon does. What other customers bought might be suitable for you as well. Just trying to humanize this space of artificial interaction a little bit and gives you some insight in how because it's important for a technology company. And maybe I draw your attention to the greenish part on the right upper corner. That's artificial and ethics, actually the part of what we talk about today, but it's just the beginning. I've written the term understanding, but we are just in the beginning of this understanding processes, because before we can actually understand something, there must be a description, at least an idea how we describe future research directions and in which type of research we want to invest our time and the effort for the upcoming years. And at that point, I would like to convey the message that it's not too late, or that's a good news. On the other hand, there's not that much time left because research takes a while. It takes years to develop the framework of thinking, to train the students, to train the next generation to think about this greenish circle. This positive user experience that I've put on the lower corner, there's not a negative experience on that slide because I was looking forward to the future at that point, is driven mainly actually by terms like safety. There's a significant difference between Europe as well as China, as well as the United States when it comes to processing personal data and privacy. Some countries have a tendency to highly appreciate that governmental agencies take care of all the parts of your personal life and do a kind of social scoring, as you know, the credit score history in the US, but in all aspects of your life. Mobility, your private life, which music you consume, which meals you prefer, whether you follow a healthy diet or not, whether you live solidarity or not, which parts of self-education you pursue. Other parts of the world, like Europe, are highly conservative when it comes to sharing those data. This has a huge impact, both on development of artificial intelligence systems, as well as on the forecasting, of, for example, of the future of individuals for insurance companies, for governmental agencies, as well as, for example, of funding even of scientific parts, because there's a different tendency to invest in different parts of research, whether it's needed or not. We had some of in the previous talk, and which I wasn't aware when I prepared my slides last week, we had some of the examples, and I wanted just to point out this Cambridge Analytica incident or accident in a way. It's not blaming actually the scientists in Cambridge Analytica, because if you think about the mathematical background, the statistical background, that was excellent work. On the other hand, there was not a statistical manifest available in that company, and often, obviously, not even a common understanding that a discussion about ethics of work or the outcome of work might be beneficial and contribute to the overall success of a research company like Cambridge Analytica. We know the end of the story. We know the political discussion about it. Obviously, now it's not available anymore. Nevertheless, if we try to bring together the scientific success from the mathematical and natural science background to a kind of social background as well, social engineering, social science could have helped Cambridge Analytica a lot to mitigate the issue that what became obvious in the end. There are many more examples that we had brought up. I just want to bring up a last technology part when it comes to forecasting and projecting personal opinions into artificial systems. It's artificial examples that I had chosen. If you think about an autonomous vacuum cleaner, it's easier to talk about that because in contrast to an autonomous vehicle when it comes to killing an object. Nevertheless, we all know that people are hurt in mobility systems. Nevertheless, it's a much simpler system. Autonomous vacuum cleaner nowadays technically can differentiate whether you have a pet living in your apartment or whether it's just a bug, or if you live southern of Tennessee, I think bugs are not that rare in daily life. So it just might happen. So, and the vacuum cleaner need to make a decision whether this kind of small animal is killed or not. Typically, and to my understanding, what we know about textbooks and from engineering of kind of picture recognition, image recognition, then most of those systems will avoid trying to hit a larger object than a specific size. in the future, when image recognition becomes more accurate, then it might differentiate between a typical bug and this kind of ladybugs, which might be nicer to look at for most humans in most cultures. So there might be a projection from your estimation, your daily life approach into a system when it comes to engineering those algorithms. That's a bias by definition. A bias may be allowed bias by engineering and actually by willing. This is a very simple approach. Nevertheless, there are biases in different cultures that needs to be assessed as early as possible, whether they meet a common ethical understanding in society or not. This is too simple to discuss it on a more large political level. Nevertheless, when it comes to hitting this group of younger people or older people, when an accident and hitting an obstacle can't be avoided, for example, for a car, then this discussion becomes more important and much more difficult to answer if you really can't avoid to give an answer. I will skip this last slide to stay in time. So enabling those rules in daily life is maybe the most complex part for a large company as Daimler is, as Mercedes-Benz in general is. So, and that was part of the message I wanted to convey. We are on the very low left part of this lower left corner where basics is written on this slide. So it's important to start now to build up the framework that is needed in the future when it comes to detailing about the understanding of ethics and artificial intelligence, because the application that is given in the middle of that slide to real situation will take a lot of time, will take a lot of effort, and will technically need to train a new generation that then gets into the positions in the large companies as well and governmental agencies in the upcoming years. It's of course possible to train people and keep them trained and adopt them to this kind of new thinking. But if you think just about the development of computer industry during the last 20 years, that with connectivity of internet services, it has flipped a lot of situations in daily life, in particular, a lot of jobs in industry as well as in government. Similar more, let's say, automated decision-making process will lead to the same situation within the next 10, 20, or even 30 years. So this ethical manifest needs to be worked on as soon as possible, because processes in digital industry are that fast that we can't wait another 10 years, because then it's almost too late. Technology from the natural science field is developing that fast that autonomous vehicles that can operate in urban areas, like in a city, in the mid-2020s, that is just 8 years from now, about 7 years from now. And processes in car industry take about usually 6 to 7 years when it comes to development. So those cars that will get in market in 2025 are started to develop now. So the ethical background, the ethical manifest that is needed actually for those decision-making processes in algorithm industry engineering needs to be started to work on now, not in 5 years, because then it's almost too late. Good news is that there's enough time if started early enough. And with the last slide, actually just a look at Stuttgart. It's a city in Germany, but that doesn't matter here. How engineers thought about, and Wolf will bring a much older picture, but maybe similar, as nice maybe as that one. In 2035, that's not that far away. We have still a lot of individual mobility. We have the train systems. Aircrafts get more electrified. US Department of Energy is investing in that field. NASA and Glenn Research Center of NASA is heavily working on that. There's a lot of research in that field. There will be more complex, more connected mobility systems in the future, where centralized information is used, where an exchange of information leads to more, let's say, connected systems, taking advantage of individual data, but sharing it with others. What we forgot when we discussed that picture is that the structure of society is moving forward to much more older people. And if you want to have a look at that, Japan is an excellent example when people, because of very healthy lifestyle, get much older. But when the need of technology to meet those demands changes dramatically within a few decades. This is missing on that picture. Nevertheless, it's actually a very positive and a truly positive perspective on the future. And with that, I would like to thank you to listen.
For 200 years, engineering has increased its usefulness for and impact on societies, industries, businesses, work and jobs. Consequently, engineering ethics has emerged as a field of applied ethics. Engineering ethics covers the obligation of engineers to clients, diverse human societies, the natural environment, and the engineering profession. Propelled by the Industrial Revolution, which has gone from local to regional first and to global lately, engineers are now changing the entire world for better or worse. Thus, a global situation, thus engineering ethics for a globalized world has become an issue. The rise of a global economy and the approach of Western or Western-trained engineers have created this new ethical frontier. Global engineering ethics must handle cultural, social, religious, curricular, and pedagogical challenges. It must provide guidance to the engineering profession in how to work responsibly in the non-Western context of developing countries. And it is expected to steer the myriad applications of technology to the millennium goal of poverty reduction and ultimately eradication. A local department now is in a very different situation. This is a daunting global situation around us, and what can a small interdisciplinary department in the College of Engineering and Applied Sciences, such as our Department of Technology and Society, do? Actually, a lot. DTS combines technical expertise with social science research and humanistic values. It can freely say engineering has become much too important to be left to the engineers, act accordingly, and therefore helps the engineering profession to respond sensibly to the growing onslaught of external demands. Specifically, DTS contributes to the development of smart engineering education in 4 critical intersections of technology and society: smart development, smart communities, smart ethics, and inclusive STEM education. DTS is a resource because mere technical solutions cannot solve the big challenges of our civilization. For example, the threat of climate change cannot be solved by SRM, solar radiation management techniques alone, such as stratospheric aerosol injection to block sunlight from reaching Earth's atmosphere. Humanity's biggest problems radiate out into billions of lives, numerous disciplines, and all politics. The urgency to expand our techno-scientific approaches toward the societal, ecological, moral, and political realms is growing quickly. Why? Because the speed of disruptive technologies is increasing rapidly, and the window for responsible innovation is shrinking constantly. Humanity's time to adapt to its own creations is running shorter and shorter. From the domestication of fire to the domestication of plants and animals during the Neolithic Revolution, the domestication of fossil fuels during the Industrial Revolution, up to the domestication of nuclear energy in the 1940s, our time to respond has shrunk from hundreds of thousands of years to 10,000 years, a few hundred years, and now decades. The development of holistic engineering design must quickly speed up locally and globally. Our topic today is a case in point. We need computational ethics for the 21st century, and we need it fast. Too many great century projects, such as self-driving cars, are racing ahead without guidance and support of computational ethics. Of course, this new branch of engineering is neither ready-made nor easy to grow. Embedding ethical principles in an AI system sounds good, but how to do it is far from clear. Even if moral machines can be built, we cannot assume that their decisions will be uncontroversial or at least acceptable, like a national Supreme Court ruling. How smart is AI? To see the current AI situation plainly, we must peel away the hype that surrounds AI and ask, how smart is artificial intelligence right now? And the answer is not as smart as a 3 to 4-year-old preschooler. Does a preschooler see what you see? Of course. He is not mistaking a puppy for a muffin. Yet Google's image recognition technology has proven less smart and even truly repugnant. It has labeled a Blackware software developer and his friend gorillas. This mistake and embarrassment happened in 2015. It was quickly fixed, yet not by making the offensive algorithm smarter, but by erasing the gorilla tag from Google Photos. Over 2 years later, Google's primitive stopgap was still blocking the service from recognizing actual gorillas. AI image recognition will eventually catch up with 3 to 4-year-old children and spot humans, primates, puppies, and muffins fast and accurately. This improvement will certainly come. Yet it is also urgently needed, because misidentifications that are only offensive when based on biased data can be deadly when they happen at 60 miles per hour in a self-driving car. Next to the hype stands the chorus of prominent AI Cassandras, ranging from Elon Musk over Prince Charles, AI is crazy, he said, to Stephen Hawking. What shall we make of that? How safe is artificial intelligence? Is AI the best or worst thing ever? A year ago, in November 2017, at the Web Summit in Lisbon, Portugal, the late Professor Hawking saw our minds amplified by AI and our computers emulating human intelligence and exceeding it. He imagined AI reversing the environmental damage done by the Industrial Revolution and eradicating poverty and disease. Yet he also warned AI could sideline us, destroy millions of jobs, and even humanity itself. Hawking said, quote, "The rise of powerful AI will be either the best or the worst thing ever to happen to humanity. What is the answer?" he asked. And he answered, to control AI and to make it work for us and to eliminate as far as possible its very real dangers. End of quote. As a historian, I'm not so sure about the best or worst thing ever, but as a contemporary, I think Hawking is correct on both counts. 1, AI hits home as our most profound challenge. 2, our techno-civilization must indeed learn to control AI, make it work for us, for humanity, and manage its dangers. The good news is something similar has been achieved once before, in December 1942, in a squash court underneath the football grandstand of the University of Chicago's Stagg Field. In this circumscribed space, Enrico Fermi and colleagues demonstrated how to control nuclear fission. The bad news is the chain reaction AI has triggered is not localized in a discrete place, but an explosion of machine learning all around the world, driven by all sorts of actors in all kinds of areas, governmental, military, industrial, and academic. Considering this unprecedented ubiquity of the AI revolution, Tech and Society has resolved to research smart ethics. That is, a universal computational ethics that could theoretically apply to all algorithms. We observe a growing student interest in what is called computing for good, C4G. Husband and wife team, Tony and Loris Kalatos from Computer Science and Tech and Society, respectively, have responded to this demand for ethical computing in our college. They have created a cross-listed undergraduate course for benevolent computing, ISE 339. But here's the rub. Voluntary forays into C4G, which excite the students that are drawn to it, are much too little and do not scale up to meet the great civilizational challenge that Hawking and others have diagnosed. Computer science needs universal guidance and mandatory classes and practical tools for ethical programming. All computer science students must learn new how-tos, how to build moral machines with algorithmic ethics, how to overcome moral Taylorism, which breaks complex projects up into small and seemingly ethically neutral tasks, how to decline sweet offers of work and money, and how to team up with philosophers, sociologists, linguists, and other strangers. In short, technology-driven societies must build computational ethics across the governmental, military, industrial, academic complex. Humanity has arrived at the crossroads again. Pure science is taking a backseat in our brave new AI-enabled world. The physical universe, humanity's first all-around nature, is receding, and our second nature is rushing into the foreground. Now we are surrounded by all the new things humanity has created and the internet has connected, from light bulbs to cell phones. The physicists who reigned supreme during the grand nuclear challenge in the 1940s have been overtaken by AI engineers, at least in terms of pay scale and societal relevance. Technoscience is leading us into the 21st century. The wisdom of the so-called deep learning of neural networks and the discoveries of big data science projects propel our AI machinery toward intelligence and smartness. More and more of our gadgets and machines acquire good enough knowledge, begin to sense and act. This progress may be slow and rocky on its own terms, as the example of Google's biased image recognition has shown, but it is blindingly fast on the larger background of global human history. The demand for computational ethics has been recognized as a foundational research challenge in a white paper for our new Institute for AI-Driven Discovery and Innovation. I quote, "As AI systems continue to expand the range of tasks they can learn to do on their own, there's increasing likelihood that they will confront ethical dilemmas. For example, should the self-driving car run over a deer or steer the car around the deer instead and crash onto the embankment on the road, possibly injuring the car's occupants? Thus, it will become increasingly important to codify ethical principles in AI systems. Embedding ethical principles in an AI system can also possibly thwart these machines from turning malevolent. Becoming malevolent is not outside the realm of possibility, as these machines train themselves through volumes of data, increasing the chances of becoming exposed to malevolent behavior. Building ethical AI systems is a novel and unique challenge. It calls for developing the new era of computational ethics, a framework for codifying ethical reasoning in machines." End of quote. Again, our historical experience is promising. Medical students have pledged the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, primum non nocere, in various forms over the centuries. The example shows that a professional group can rise to the challenge of risky and dangerous knowledge. A similar golden rule was proposed by Karl Popper, Joseph Rotblat, and others for natural scientists in the second half of the 20th century. But that oath did not materialize. Chemists who weaponized gas in the First World War and physicists who produced nuclear bombs in the Second had ample reason to embrace an overarching code of conduct, but they could not bring themselves to limit their sweet. That was a term from Robert Oppenheimer, and said the research on nuclear bombs is actually sweet. They cannot limit that. Facing the possibilities of malevolent AI, computer scientists could join the medical profession by lifting engineering onto the track of ethics. Yet they can also follow the other beckoning track that promises untrammeled freedom for unlimited research. The image that you see here is misleading. Our pathways into the future are not laid out like railroad tracks with well-defined stations in the years 2024, 2042, and 2081. Our future looks more like this: cloudy, with few details, and no certainty that green turf or anything else now visible will continue on either side. Ethical AI can be understood in many ways. For instance, it could be read as a skeptical question, an inquiry that would ask, isn't unethical AI more likely than ethical AI? Will moral machines take over that exhibit tribal biases and other ethical failures? Can malevolent AI win the race? I think we should consider that prospect. The victory of malevolent AI is perhaps not likely, but utterly possible. Humanity could be swamped with ethical questionable AI engines, algorithms that will elevate economic inequalities and exacerbate societal prejudices about races, genders, religions, and other relational issues. Unethical AI could put discrimination on a quasi-scientific level of excellence, and malevolent AI could turn against humanity. I don't want to elaborate this scenario, but would like to warn computer science against stopgap remedies, such as outsourcing the ethics questions to the philosophy department. What else than a Reader's Digest course in ethics can come of that? More serious work is needed to equip computer science students with the crucial new how-tos mentioned earlier. Ethical AI could be understood positively and answered affirmatively as well. And why not? Ethical AI is entirely possible. Moral machines could be designed that would handle moral problems not only faster, but also better and more consistently than human brains. Autonomous automobiles could be built that will cause far fewer accidents than human-driven cars. Furthermore, the smart ethics of AI-driven vehicles could execute moral reasoning on a much higher and more reasonable level than normal humans normally exhibit. I don't want to elaborate this scenario either, but would like to remind the skeptics among you about the career of chess-playing engines. They came a long way since Wolfgang von Kempelen's fake Mechanical Turk from 1977. I say fake because in actual fact, there was a human hidden in that machine. Chess algorithms had to wait for Alan Turing and Claude Shannon, who developed the first two chess engines independently in the late 1940s. From then on, chess-playing algorithms evolved quickly. IBM's Deep Blue defeated world chess champion Garry Kasparov in 1997. We might expect a similar outcome for ethics engines. However, let's complicate this optimistic perspective with a trolley problem. Automotive AI engineers are disinclined to engage with the many variations and difficulties of this famous thought experiment. Given the supreme engineering goal of total safety, their reluctance is understandable. Autonomous cars will seek collision-free paths and avoid the danger cones of all potential obstacles. They will not drive into dicey situations, but steer away from them. Eventually, car accidents will disappear and become a thing of the past. Christoph von Hugo, Mercedes-Benz's manager of driver assistance systems, expressed the total safety vision perfectly. He said, after sorting through thousands of terabytes of real-world test data and multiples of that in simulations, answers to the trolley problem will become less important as the advantages of ever alert autonomous cars become apparent. Nevertheless, enlightened by the arguments of Derek Leben, a philosopher who has wrestled with the design of ethics algorithms for autonomous machines, I would still uphold the importance of the trolley problem. First, because an automotive AI system, which is constantly trying to avoid accidents, is always juggling better or worse trajectories. Hence, it is implicitly making moral judgments. Second, it is implausible that dilemma-style collisions will completely disappear. They could become extremely rare, but hardly shrink to zero. Hence, the venerable practice of bioethics to consider extreme and unusual situations should be emulated in the automotive ethics lab. Thank you. So if those of you who do not have to run away would like I may take a crack at it. I would say, and this needs, of course, more elaboration. Ethics in philosophy has been distinguished, right? There is let's say, we all know there's something called utilitarian ethics. There was a famous German philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant, who has developed his own ethics, Kantian ethics. And there is an ethics that's called libertarian ethics, and they are all very distinctive. And the problem we have is that we have a very large body of work that has differentiated different ethics, that we would not be helped if now, let's say, because Mercedes-Benz is a German company and said, okay, we go with Kantian ethics, and then Toyota goes with Buddhist ethics or something else or so, right? I mean, the problem we have is to go on a higher level of ethical reasoning. That is a huge problem because, as you can immediately see, that's also a political problem, right? And so on and so forth. So, but it's a theoretical possibility that humanity could say, okay, we go, and the last slide I showed, this philosopher, he thinks he's following Rawls, that's an American philosopher, but very, very, influential and good. But there is some hope or some idea that you could develop a universal ethics. If that would be possible, then of course, all the machinery that has ethics implied would act on that level, and you would expect that then ethical decisions done in milliseconds would be universal, would be consistent, and would be actually much better than the human response in that thing. So, but this is a theoretical possibility, and we see immediately that it's a huge practical, political, cultural, and so on problem.
I mean, to my way of thinking, I think of ethics as very much a human thing. That's when I read my definition, it had the word people in it, and it had to, and you know, in a world where different societies seem to come up with different ethical systems and come up with different ethical judgments, I would not want an AI system trying to come up with what the right ethical thing to do is. If you want to think of you know, learn about the world and figure out what ethics is, to a certain extent, I think this is where human supervision of the machines, what is it that we want our technology to do? Okay, what is it that we value? Where are the trade-offs we value? These, I think, are human questions, and they're not really machine learning questions on some level.
And of course, it's very important that ethical artificial intelligence will develop over time. So it's possible just to adjust and correct some of the functionalities that will be applied in the beginning, when actually it's just trying to replicate how humans work into maybe a more advanced system in the future, to adopt it to maybe the experience that was made based on the kind of generation one of those systems. So this kind of, the Wolf had one picture of this Space Odyssey movie, I guess, where the computer in the end killed, I think, most of the astronauts. I think that's a very pessimistic perspective on the future. Most of the AI systems will most likely help humans in the beginning to support them in making decisions on the wall. And then there's a development process too, and that it comes back to your question, to transfer how decisions are made by humans into in silico into the computer chips, and then actually to optimize those algorithms. So I don't see a very pessimistic outcome of the discussion about ethical AI. But first, we need to understand how this ethical decision making in humans really works, which of those might be applicable to computerized systems. I don't know how many decades Kant had to develop his philosophy. Certainly, we don't have that much time for artificial intelligence. Well, just from the technology background, it might be much easier just to think about processes of decision making rather than to trying to mimic the brain, because we rarely know anything about how humans really work. If you just think about it in daily life, quite a digital process like sexuality, but in biology, it's a highly complex process. And we just from medical background, we don't know very much about it. We don't even know how genes are coded, how it developed, whether it's more actually something that is decided before a child is born, whether it's more trained by education. And those philosophies change over decades. Currently, it's more decision and gender mainstreaming discussions, whether it might be trained via society. It's not everything is determined by biology before a child is born. This opinion might change or not. So, but getting in those discussions actually shows a good example why those processes take that long. On the other hand, then it's much easier to think about how a straightforward decision-making process in technology is made and how this can be translated into an algorithm. Usually it consists of a lot of yes and no decisions, whether you try to evaluate the value of a certain path. It has nothing to do with human value, but just which one has a higher probability, which might lead to, like the chessboard system does, it just tries to predict all the other moves that you might do and predict a certain probability of those moves in a chess play, and just tries then to find a strategy how to beat you.
I will say just one thing, that current AI systems certainly do not have anything under the hood more than a very vague, a vague, let's say, metaphoric similarity to the way brains work. So I think it's fair to say that the intelligent systems people build will not be particularly inspired by, simulating brains or how brains work. Okay, it's a different kind of a beast, and I still think that there's some guidance here of human guidance of what it is you want these systems to do, and that's where I think the ethics comes.
Just to give you just a short example on why we are somewhat limited in the end in processing data, for example, in an autonomous car, if a computerized system consumes that's the current status of the state of the art, 7 to 8 kilowatts of electrical power. That's about the power you need just to drive at city speed, and half the power you need to drive on a highway. It's about 4 times the power your air conditioner needs. Then it becomes questionable whether we are somewhat limited or not limited in processing data. So similar to the Secret Service example, there are some daily life limitations in which the amount of data can be processed in a certain time. And just to add that as a footnote, we cannot link everything to cloud services because the velocity of light is too slow. If you send it to some data center somewhere in the countryside and get back your data processed, just transferring data via classifiable systems takes too long once you have just a few milliseconds to make a decision. Yes.
Okay, I would say you have given us lots of reasons to be optimistic that the problems created by AI might be solved if we're careful and attentive. But what about use by totalitarian regimes? Somebody mentioned the KGB. Imagine the KGB existed today and had access to data about the whole population. That is a very scary thought. So I guess it's a difficult discussion to have because it's political, but that is the most dominating in my mind.
May I?
I would say you don't have to worry about think KGB. You can think, for example, today in modern China. Okay, is a good example of a country where there is a tremendous there's tremendous amount of work in AI being done in China. They have tremendous amounts of data. They have tremendous amounts of cameras and sensors hooking things up, and everything is very much a top-down structure. There is certainly there certainly are ways in which this technology is going to shape things like of surveillance and things like that in ways that people in the United States would feel very uncomfortable with. And the questions of whether this is ethically a good thing or a bad thing, this I claim is somewhat of a cultural issue. I certainly would not want to live in a world where that was happening, but that may not be a universal,
That in major parts of science, for example, in the medical field, when it comes to the processing of and the handling of highly sensitive, highly personal data, then certainly an international level understanding might be very important. So I fully accept that there's a very different understanding in different parts of the world. For example, if we stay with the Chinese example, if major parts of a population in China is willing to accept a social score system where all your daily behavior is screened, evaluated, and put in a kind of number, like a credit history, and people accept that or even appreciate them, and might be just an acceptable, different understanding. So I share some issues with that because of how the regime operates, we don't know whether the polls really represent the real opinion. And in particular, if we come back to this mind, let's say health style question or health insurance question, AI tends then to penetrate into daily life, in fact, from the optimistic side, but might have very bad long-term effects. For example, just linking the data from your American Express, Visa, or MasterCard bill per month, checking whether you buy cookies or salad or carrots every day, every week, assuming you eat them, in the end. And just linking that to your last blood sugar analysis, to the way how you exercise, because checking the data of your smartwatches, your smartphone, might lead to a data pool that has not only a kind of optimistic perspective on the future. There are few insurance companies in the world linking the style of driving, the style of consuming, and the style of doing the exercise to a kind of rate that you pay per month for insurance. And because they started from an optimistic approach, those companies started to give incentives to people having insurance with those insurance companies, just trying to incentivize those who are willing to share data. On the long-term aspects, that's something that's at least ethical, from an ethical standpoint, very questionable, because then there's a tendency to separate a young, healthy, actually quite sportive group from the mainstream group and trying to separate them over time. That's not the background idea of how insurance companies, how insurance groups like risk management groups operate. So I share your issues, absolutely. And that's why we need that discussion in particular, preferably on an international level. But if this can't be enabled, at least at, let's say, in the Western world.
I thought the Prometheus was interesting because you mentioned, bringing fire, and I think probably today nobody here is terribly afraid of fire. We know how to deal with it as a modern society. And then I thought of two examples that touch us today in modern life. One is 50, 60 years old. Well, I guess more like 80 years old. You mentioned Robert Oppenheimer and the development of the nuclear bomb, and that was sort of done under the duress of trying to win a war, And then I think of a very modern day example of Facebook that's only a dozen years old or so, where their motto was move fast and break things. And I think both of these, the atomic bomb being 80 or 90 years old, 80 years old, whatever it is, we still haven't really put the cap on the nuclear bottle. I think we all, even very recently, in just the past 12 or 24 months, have had a bit of on-edge feeling about some nuclear situations. And Facebook, right today, makes us all a little nervous about what they've set up. And I don't think they ever intended to do that. I think engineers like to go out and build things, and probably are just really fascinated by the technology. I know I, as an engineer, was. So we're building things very quickly. I don't think the autonomous car is really something that I worry about anyway, because I think Mercedes-Benz and the other car manufacturers are going to work to make those very safe. But I'm thinking, is there a historical example that can make us feel all a little bit comfortable and not feel like this may turn into some sort of dystopian future? Or we can look at other technologies where we finally reined them in, and that maybe we could feel a little more hopeful that the combination of ethics, legal, and perhaps market forces can kind of make us feel like this is not a dystopian situation where we're going to end up with machines controlling our lives or poking into areas of our lives that we really, like you mentioned, don't want to live in a world like China is beginning to set up with their social scores.
I think atomic bombs are an interesting world, I guess, in that we have had them for 80 years and we haven't blown ourselves up. And there is, there are game theoretic reasons why, working against that. So that's an example where, despite having adversarial, parties, we have managed to kind of reach enough of a consensus that they shouldn't be used, that we've gotten this far and we're muddling along. And, my guess is we are likely to muddle along on that for, arbitrarily far into the future. And so maybe that would be an option. Somehow this feels different, though. It feels like the number of agents with AI, individual companies are agents, individual countries are agents. You've got a lot more players in this kind of thing, and with a lot more set of values and a lot less ways you can regulate it and stuff like that. And so it's going to be interesting. And I think that within a society, it is, I think that these are political discussions that need to start to be happening, and society has to be having that debate. And how this works across societies is going to be an interesting thing to figure out. I don't think I have an answer there. Okay, ideally, this would be something that would be talked about at, international organizations and things like that. I don't get the sense the world is really moving in that direction as much as I would like it to have.
Yeah, and So I will allow one more question because people also have to go to other things in life, right? And but I think the question that came, that was asked before, what all the possibilities are, indeed, and we mentioned the KGB and the Stasi, right, the East German Secret Service sitting of reams of data, but doesn't having the technology to deal with it. So you get nostalgic almost about that time. So you're absolutely right. This is very dangerous, but it is something I think I would agree that big challenges need big answers and they need big efforts. And one of the efforts or the beginning is to ask the right questions and to begin conversations. So what we can do here is we start a conversation, right? That has to continue. And if that doesn't continue, then remember what I said, that we are running out of time. I mean, the window of adaptation and the speed of innovation are contracted. And so that makes the challenge even bigger. And one last question, and then I will just say that the Global Forum does exactly this is you? Yeah. The Global Forum is a beginning of that conversation.
Hello, thank you. Would you say the overall sentiment of the AI research community is generally genuinely in favor of ethics in AI?
I would say, I mean, if you're asking me, I would say the answer is yes. That kind of the, again, AI is a relatively old field in computer science. I will say going back, depending on how you define it, you might define it as starting in the 50s. And these systems really didn't have very much power until very recently. That's kind of, I guess, the reason why the question's being asked now. And a lot of, let's say, the problems with things like biased systems and things like that weren't really recognized, I will say, until like 2 or 3 years ago. Generally speaking, I think most people who are working on these things don't poo-poo that these are problems. They're aware now that these are kind of problems and that they are things, one has to think about when engineering and validating a system. So generally speaking, I think that there is a positive attitude towards that. Again, different people have different degrees of extents to which they will take it, and but I think generally speaking, I would say it's a positive thing.
Okay. Let me just thank the panel. Thank you very much that you participated, and I hope we can continue that conversation in many different forms. And thank you for coming, and come again. One of the next global forums will be on engineering planetary health. Another topic that's not too small. Okay, thank you.
Okay.